Well, let us turn to the portion of Scripture we've read in the Old Testament, in the book of Job. And, well, for some of us, we continue looking at this book. And some of us, we maybe join for the first time, but we are just beginning. And some of the things that we've seen so far is that this is not a book that tries to explain why there is evil in this world. And it is not either a book that tries to justify or give a reason for why the righteous suffer. It is a book that mainly speaks to us about God's sovereignty, God's power, God's rule, and the relationship or the situation that his children are placed in their lives, in the world, because of this. Now, what is reality? Is there more to reality than meets the eye? In the second book of Kings, we are clearly shown that reality is much more than simply what we see. The situation there is serious. The enemies of Israel are surrounding the city of Dothan, where Elisha, God's prophet, was at the time. And they did so that they could apprehend him. And when Elisha's servant got up in the morning, his waking nightmare started. This is what we read there in 2 Kings chapter 6. When the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said, Alas, my master, what shall we do? He said, Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Then Elisha prayed and said, O Lord, please, open his eyes, that he may see. So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Reality is much more than what we can see. But of course, Job did not have the privilege this servant of Elisha had himself. He did not know what took place behind the scene of time and space as he was to endure what he was to endure. A commentator writes, The veil between the seen and the unseen has been lifted. The heavenly court is in session. The Lord is on his throne, and legions of angels are present. Summoned by God, Satan comes before the court as the accuser of God's people. And so this veil is lifted, of course, for us. And we can see what takes place. And on this occasion, it is not the adversary, the accuser, who takes the initiative, but God, who has summoned him to appear into his presence with the rest of the angelic beings. God asks him very specifically, Have you seen Job? Have you seen my servant Job? There's none like him. He is a man who fears God. He is a man of integrity. He is a man that people even recognize as somebody who is right. Now, at the beginning, through the early verses of the book, we see that there is this wisdom of God, the wisdom that comes from on high, as seen in the experience of Job. He fears the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom. And he is one man who is very conscious that he must fulfill the creation mandate, fill the earth, subdue it. And he acts as a priest for his family. And the question that continues now is, will this wisdom stand the test? Is it worthwhile to apply God's principles? Is it worthwhile to worship God in the face of what is coming? Now, of course, what follows in the first chapter, from verse 6 to chapter 10, and verse 10, is a challenge to the value of this wisdom of setting our eyes on God and trusting in his sovereign care. And the challenge, in a way, is the same as the challenge at the very beginning of history. You see, the question is, are God's ways valuable, or are other alternatives that may come and be presented to be considered? You see, the accuser came on this occasion before God, as he came before Adam at the beginning, and basically arguing that his alternative for this world and for life was better than God's. And of course we know what Adam's response was, how he believed the accuser, believed the adversary. But now he comes before God, and he comes with the same argument. And here the conflict of the ages is displayed. You see, Meredith Kline, who wrote a very interesting, though not long, commentary on Job, wrote these words: "He who is wise unto salvation is aware of the demonic dimension of history, the age-long fury of Satan against the seed of the woman, that is Christ and his people. The adversary charged that Job's godly wisdom was not genuine, that his piety was only a temporary byproduct of his prosperity." You see, there is in this chapter a look behind the scenes of this challenge that takes place, in a sense, all throughout history between God's ways and the adversary's ways. Let us look at a few ideas in connection with this as we look at this conflict between light and darkness. The first thing that we may observe is the intensity of Satan's enmity. Now, of course, the attitude of the accuser is seen everywhere in Scripture, and nowhere better than in the Gospels. Because there is that we see really what is God's plan, what is Satan's plan for those that he can control under God's authority. We read, for example, in Luke chapter 8, "Then they sailed to the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. When Jesus had stepped out on the land, there met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he had not lived in a house, but among the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, 'What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me.'" And if you remember, the condition that the Gospels tell us about that man was a disaster, was so sad, so difficult, so hard to bear. But you see, this is the best that Satan has got for man. The picture he paints may be a different one, but this is his true intention. He wants to be acknowledged, but he doesn't give a blessing. So what is the intensity of Satan's enmity as shown in verses 6 to 12 of Job chapter 1? The first thing that we can see, of course, is the pride that generates it. And this becomes obvious when the Lord, verse 7, questions Satan, and he tells God what he has been doing, and basically he accuses God of bribing Job. Verse 8, "Then Satan answered the Lord and said, 'Does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land.'" You see, Satan comes before the Lord, and as I've said, now at this stage, he accuses God of bribing Job. I mean, you've given him so much that how would he not worship you? Now, the first thing that we need to realize as we begin, or as we continue, just at the beginning of looking at this book, is what is Satan's position? And what we need to realize is that he is absolutely subordinated. You see, he's along with all other creatures, visible and invisible. He is subordinated to the God whom Job feared. Now, he would like to think otherwise. Maybe in his foolishness, he even does. But his ways are subordinate to God's, for ultimately they are part of God's decree. A Dutch theologian who taught at the Free University of Amsterdam said on one occasion as he lectured, There cannot be sound theology without a sound demonology. You see, we cannot have a sound theology. We cannot understand properly God and God's ways if we don't have, together with that, a proper understanding of Satan and his ways. You see, because he comes as one who has independent authority. This is what sort of transpires in this encounter between Satan and God. He comes as one who has independent authority. He is who decides to go through and through the earth. He is who does that. He is who does that. But he doesn't. He does not have independent authority. As Luther expressed it, as Martin Luther expressed it, even the devil is God's devil. And John Calvin tells us with different but similar words. He says that God's decree of evil is not bare permission, as if God sat in a watchtower awaiting chance events and his judgments thus depended upon human will. You see, Satan was defeated the very moment he decided to rebel against God. He was defeated because he was rebelling against the one under whom he was in authority, against the one whose power was beyond anything that Satan could even dream to have. He was the most beautiful creature. Scripture tells us that he was the light bearer, that his appearance was wonderful and majestic, but of course not like God, though he thought he was. And this is the first thing that as we look through this book, it is important to realize and to remember. And as we look at the problem that Job confronts and the experience of Job, and as we are conscious that the experience of Job, and in this case his suffering, has to do very much with the instigation of Satan, we need to remember and re-emphasize that he is not an independent authority. He is absolutely subordinated. And this comes even so clear when, if you look at chapter 2 and the way that God speaks. If you look at verse 3 in chapter 2, have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. And he says, now God says he holds fast his integrity, although you destroyed him without reason. Well, of course not. Satan may have thought that he was doing the destroying. Satan may have thought that he was the authority behind Job's misfortunes. But he wasn't. God says, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. You see, he comes before the Lord with pride, even assuming that he has independent authority, but he doesn't. And then the intensity of Satan's enmity is also highlighted or even increased because of the faith that enrages him. In chapter 1 and verse 8, we are given God's point of view in connection with Job. This is not society's point of view. That was also true. But here we are given God's point of view. And Satan is enraged because he simply will not accept that fallen creatures that have taken his side, children of Adam that have been born in sin, that they can actually be changed in their hearts to become servants of God out of love. Of course, we know it's not that we loved him first, it's that he loved us. But that is something that it's out of Satan's mind. He insists here in chapter 1, as he will insist in chapter 2. He loves you because you have given him so much. God glorifies himself by pointing to Job as a creation of his redemptive grace. Job loves me. Job is a righteous man. But Satan challenges this. He challenges it, of course, in terms of what he has got, what God has given him. And there is a challenge even to God's holy character. It is a satanic assault on not only on the integrity of Job, but also on the integrity of God. God has bribed Job so that he may act in a pious way. But of course we know that this is not the case, that Job is indeed a righteous man, as we will see through the book. Now, he is a righteous man in the eyes of God. That doesn't mean that he is a perfect individual who never needed God's grace. Of course, these verses at the beginning of, verses 11, 12, are also a clear indication of the character of Satan. He is determined to challenge God's word. And he is determined to challenge the Creator, and without reason whatsoever, he is ready to do as much harm as he possibly can to this man who is a challenge to the adversary's ways. That is the intensity of Satan's enmity. And of course we know about this, even in the pages of the New Testament. We need to be aware. The Apostle Peter, who in his own experience knew so very well what it meant to be shaken by the adversary, he wrote to the readers of his first letter, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." That doesn't mean he can devour anyone. That doesn't mean that he can destroy the elect of God. That doesn't mean he can take possession of those that are God's children. But he's trying, and he will continue to try. There's intensity of his enmity we should never forget. But then we can also observe in this portion of scripture we've read here the grace of Job's integrity. And there's a grace that is shown in the face of a completely unequal contest. Satan knows what is about to happen under God's authority. Job has no idea. Job is not aware of the conflict. He's not aware at all. Now, if we would bring this into today's terms, this is a man who has, I don't know how much real estate, and he has investments in so many companies, and he has money in the bank, and he has fleets of cars and trucks, and he has businesses that belong to him. Again, when we started to look at this book, I told the congregational of Karen that he was like Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, and so, I mean, he was the richest man at the time. Now just imagine that in the course of a day, his businesses collapse. The fleet of cars and trucks and planes and ships and whatever he's got are completely destroyed. Money becomes completely valueless. And his family, his immediate family, is destroyed. What would the reaction be? But you see, God's grace has reached Job. He's a righteous man. He's not righteous in himself. He's righteous because he has believed God. He has trusted his promise. We thought about this when we realized that he was a man who gave sacrifices. He was conscious of the need of blood to cleanse from sin. As at the very beginning, one of the children of Adam had. that he was conscious that blood had to be shed for the remission of sin, for the cleansing of sin. And Job was righteous in the eyes of God because he had believed God as Abraham. And he was a righteous man. And he has been reached by God's grace in this way. And even in the face of such calamities, of this tragedy, he will not waver. He will not waver. Somebody has written, if Job were an atheist, he would have had an explanation for what has just happened. The world is a cruel place. If Job were a polytheist, a dualist, a materialist, or a fatalist, he would have had a ready explanation for his loss, human weakness, or the forces of nature. But Job believes in the living God, who is sovereign over the forces of nature as well as the enemies to the east. Job knows that his God is supremely good. But the grace of God is seen in such a strength, with such power here, because Job, who does not know the reason of why these things are happening, Job, who does not have an explanation whatsoever for why is it that the God who controls all things, the God who controls the Sabaeans, the God who controls the Chaldeans, the God who controls the wind and the rain, the God who controls all things, is the God who has determined that these things would happen to him. He doesn't know why, but God's grace has reached him, has grabbed his heart and mind. And in spite of the fact that there is humanly speaking, every reason to follow the wife's advice, he will not. But of course this continues because in chapter 2, we don't need to elaborate there, but in chapter 2 we realize that Satan comes again before God, and he tells, basically God, he tells him, well, you haven't done enough to him. But touch his own life, his own health. And we can't know exactly what is this illness that is described here. I mean, there's symptoms that we are given, but throughout the book, we are told of some things. Job is described, or the illness that Job has is described, for example, here in chapter 2, as an irritating skin disease. He needs to take a piece of broken pottery to scratch himself. He is by himself. He's outside of where people live. His appearance is too disgusting. He has got parasites. They're maggots in his ulcers of the skin. There's extreme weakness. He's got terrifying nightmares. He feels like his bones are eroded. Weakness, deep weakness. A degenerative skin disease. We are told in chapter 30, in verse 30, that there's a blackening of the skin and the skin falling off. I mean, a complete tragedy in his own life, in his own body. Now, it's not possible to determine if some were the result of others, but the collection of symptoms, of evidence of what Job was going through is certainly overwhelming beyond imagination. Satan has been prevented from taking Job's life, but again, Job doesn't know. I mean, we know that God has told Satan, do with his body, I mean with his health, whatever you will, but don't kill him. Job doesn't know. Job, I mean, facing what he's facing and seeing the reality of his own health, he must have thought, certainly I'm dying, I'm about to die. Why? Why is this coming to me? Haven't I offered sacrifices for my children? And for himself, he would have too. Am I not acknowledged as a man who is fearful of God, who fears God? Am I not acknowledged as an upright man? That's what we read at the very beginning of the book. And that is not God's opinion. That is the opinion of the people that lived at the time. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, who feared God and turned away from evil. Why is all this happening to me? I've tried. And this incurable disease was such as to reduce this former prince of Eastern patriarchs, that was reverenced above all others by his fellow men, is now an outcast of human society. As somebody has put it once, renowned as the salt of the earth, he was driven out as its offscouring. His dwelling was in the utter desolation of what was probably the town dunghill. Why? Job doesn't know that he is not about to die, but even then, and even when he's given this brilliant advice, this brilliant, wonderful counsel by his wife, curse God and die, God's grace again has grabbed him. And yes, throughout the book there are moments when we see Job wondering. And when we see Job very, very tried. But you see, God's grace has grabbed him. And although as covered that faith Job had may have been at some points of his experience that this book tells us about, as dim as that faith may have been, that faith is still there.